It's a great pleasure to be here. I really thank the Korea Foundation and KDI and the others who've been organizing all of this. It's a terrific opportunity to have an exchange of views. And I noticed last night that I think I've met half of those of you who are fellows, and I certainly look forward in the course of the day and tomorrow to meet the rest of you. The thing that I would like to say in terms of the issues that were posed to us about on this panel is that the whole question of the global debate on growth that we're having now in the G20 and in the world at large is really a deep clash of ideas that has been going on for decades. And that's actually why it's important. And Korea actually figures very large. The Korean experience figures very large in that debate. I mean, this is a debate that really began in a certain sense with Locke and Rousseau. Locke with his idea that the basis of society was on private property ownership and individualism, and Rousseau's idea of the social contract. And really the debate that's been going on, at least in my adult life, in politics, in the world, has been a debate between those two basic themes, threads, ideas, philosophies. So, and it turns out that the current issue of foreign affairs has a commemorative section that's quite lengthy called The Clash of Ideas, the ideological battles that made the modern world and will shape the future. And so what I'm saying to you is, I mean, I just happened to pick this up and throw it in my briefcases on my way out after I'd already written the paper. So there is some corroboration beyond me that this is a fundamental issue that we're going through now. And I think realizing that helps us understand it. So Korea has been absolutely at the center of this debate because in the 1980s, and I have to say I was directly involved in this, there was a huge debate in the international economic and development economics community which involved the IMF and the World Bank about what was the nature and causes of the East Asian miracle stories, what was then called the newly industrializing country. At the time, the first wave of NICs, or newly industrializing countries, figured Korea was one of 4 countries with Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan that had started to generate very high rates of economic growth of 10% or more based on export growth rates of roughly 20%. So this was unprecedented rate of growth and a big challenge to the economics profession to figure out why this was happening. So the debate that we had, believe it or not, was between the mainstream that thought that what was happening and why these economies were growing fast was that they were liberalizing their trade regime, opening their economies to world market forces, getting prices right, and therefore were becoming more competitive than the rest of the world based on market forces, and that was leading to the dynamism. Now, why did the economics profession come to that conclusion? Because that's what basic neoclassical theory tells you, is that competitiveness means that you have a set of market forces which create Pareto optimal allocations of resources, which lead you to be very competitive and hence to dynamic growth. So if you have these emerging economies, dynamic emerging economies coming out of the water, so to speak, and your theory doesn't explain it, then your intellectual apparatus is fundamentally flawed. It took me a long time in the debate to realize why the people that I was debating and the multitudinous number of conferences that I went to everywhere, why they were so firm in their view that markets were basically driving the East Asian experience. Now, probably most of you realize that that's not the whole story. And in fact, the 4 countries we were talking about were quite different. I mean, Hong Kong would have fitted that model reasonably well. But Singapore, Taiwan, and Korea certainly didn't. And especially Korea did not. Why not? Because Korea had a view of how to achieve development, which was strategic. It was a vision that entailed using the private sector, using market forces, but steering the economy, leading the economy towards a vision of dynamic growth based on industrialization and manufactured exports. But what happened was that you had very high investment and savings rates in Korea. You had a strategic vision, just to stylize it for you, which entailed generating externalities and synergies between sectors, so that they focused on steel, ships, and cars. So if you stop to think about it, if you need the steel to make the ships and the cars, and you need the ships to export the cars and the steel, right? So you've created scale economies by generating industries which complement each other and which drive a very dynamic pattern of growth which exceeds the rate of growth of world trade. I mean, the thing that always puzzled me was that the mainstream economists thought that if their paradigm was correct, then what would happen is that the open economies, as it were, as they were describing them, would then grow as fast as world trade. There's nothing that would explain why they would grow faster than world trade. But they were growing faster than world trade because it wasn't export-led growth in the classic sense of world demand driving this internal growth and industrialization. Rather, it was investment-led growth, which was complemented by policies and investments by the state, which supported the internal dynamism of Korea, which then led to the exports. So instead of it being externally induced internal dynamics, it was an internal dynamic that ended up pushing exports out, which increased the market share of Korea, rather than just responding to market demand abroad. So it was a fundamentally different view, but the problem was that the government, economic policy, strategic vision, strategic planning had a role in explaining this dynamism, which was not included, in fact rejected by the mainstream, because the best economy was the economy that had the government which governed least, that had a hands-off view of the market. So it was a debate that went on for 15 years, and I think still in a way goes on today. So basically, I think the mainstream misread the Korea story. And the reason was that there was an ideological commitment to the market, when in fact what the Koreans were doing was a very pragmatic, very selective, very strategic use of the advantages of both the market and the state to contribute to the extraordinary economic dynamism of Korea. So what you had was, for a while, the way this debate went forward was those of us who were dissenting from the mainstream view were accused of having a state-led vision of explaining the market dynamics of Korea and the other East Asian stories, where in fact, that was not what we were saying, or that was not what we ended up believing, which was, and what ends up being true, I think, without doubt, is that it was really the combination of the state and the market in Korea that made the difference, not a choice between state-led growth and market-led growth. That's the ideological, political way of putting it, but that's not helpful in explaining what the Koreans were actually doing. So we had this sort of public vision with private sector collaboration, with capturing externalities and synergies through selective policy interventions and public investments in the market, not a socialist or state-led, state-driven growth. So that was the 1980s. And the debt crisis was going on in the 1980s as well. Latin America was doing poorly, and part of the story was a debate between why Latin America, which was attributed to having interventionist, inward-looking, import-substituting industrialization instead of outward-oriented externally driven, market-driven dynamism as did East Asia. But I'm not going to. But that was the false contrast between. It turned out there were characteristics that Latin America and East Asia shared. The big dynamic countries like Mexico and Brazil, for example, were more similar to the East Asian stories than different. So the other side of the argument didn't hold up, in fact, in Asia, and it didn't hold up, in fact, in the comparison between Latin America and East Asia. But nonetheless, the mainstream continued to make this argument, and it was echoed by the politics of the time. Ronald Reagan famously said at the United Nations that what we needed was free trade, free markets, and free enterprise. Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister of Britain. The economic climate of the times was very market-driven and market-dominated. And at the end, our friend and colleague across the street at the Peterson Institute, John Williamson, held a conference in which he fashioned the Washington Consensus, which sort of put into a paradigm of 10 principles of liberalization, deregulation, and market orientation, the Washington Consensus, which became the kind of hallmark for this as the Soviet Union fell apart and as Eastern Europe tried to find its pathway towards development. The debate then shifted from East Asia versus Latin America to Eastern Europe. But by the mid-90s, after the wall had gone down, the development community found itself without a vision. Because in the end, whether we liked it or not, and we didn't like it, but in the end, what was going on in the development community was that aid was driven by the big classic clash of ideas between communism and capitalism, between the Soviet Union and the West. And clearly, without the Soviet Union there anymore, that particular driving force for the development cooperation and foreign aid and official development assistance was missing. So what happened, I happened to be at the time, I had been at the OECD where development cooperation is coordinated, or was the site for that. It's beginning to change now for different reasons. And I became chief economist and head of the policy bureau at AID and the US AID representative to the donor community. And so I ended up participating in this debate, which ended up pulling from the UN conferences summits a set of international development goals, which later became the basis for what we now know as the Millennium Development Goals. But in that period, there were 7 development goals that were very specific and echoed again, as I say, in the MDGs, which had to do with reducing poverty, gender equality, health, education, and environmental sustainability. And that really became the paradigm for at least the way the international community and the donor community opened its dialogue with developing countries in the mid-90s around an agenda which was quite different than the sort of economics-dominated agenda which had gone forward in the post-Cold War period. It added these social and environmental issues to the economic agenda so that you had a pluralized approach now, a multidisciplinary, multi-sector, multi-ministerial approach to development rather than a purely economic one. So this made quite a difference in terms of reducing the role of economists, for one thing, in the development discussion, because now health experts, environmental experts, anthropologists, sociologists, lawyers, other disciplines and other actors became involved in the development paradigm in a new way. But I think that, so what we get from that experience, I think, is that development does not depend on growth alone, but must have investment in people, must have investment in women, must have environmental aspects, must be concerned directly with the poverty issue rather than treating it as just a trickle down from economic growth. And the second thing I think we came to realize out of that experience was that each of these goals was, once we had them, we realized that each one was inextricably linked to the other, that you weren't going to cut the proportion of people living in poverty in half by 2015 without gender equality, without educating having everyone have primary education, but focusing especially on women, without focusing on health. People can't be productive if they're unhealthy. Without environmental sustainability, which actually affects health, right? If you don't have water and sanitation because you don't have investment in those sectors, you have a polluted environment in which people get unhealthy, which means they can't be productive and so on. So which I'll come back to, is that the MDGs really helped us not only broaden the concept of development, but also see that there was a linked imperative. If you didn't do it all, you didn't get any of it, because you didn't develop the synergies. You don't just worry about child mortality. You have to think about air and water quality at the same time. So environment and health were inextricably linked, and we've all learned that investing in women, I regret to say, is obviously a much more productive thing to do than invest in men, because they tend to take care of children, they take care of the household, they worry about education, they worry about health. And so so these all became linked. I mean, it's quite interesting. Okay, so where are we now? Where we are now with the G20 is, again, we have a number of a sort of plethora of issues that are on the agenda, which I would submit to you are inextricably linked in the same way that the MDGs are. So what are those? Those are the G20's relationship with the Financial Stability Board, which the G20 itself created and put all of the G20 countries on. It replaced the Financial Stability Forum, as you know, which was highly Eurocentric, transatlantic-centric, and left out basically the non-Western world, which is completely, so the London Summit changed that and put financial stability on the agenda, first of all, and I'll come back to that as well, and also had the 20 countries in it. And then the second thing, which has been discussed or alluded to here, is the whole, in the first panel that Mark was on, which is the whole, and that many of you are participating in, is the whole global rebalancing effort, and that being linked to this framework for strong, sustainable, and balanced growth because of the obvious divergence of having deficits and surpluses concentrated in too few countries, not just the US and China, but other deficit and surplus countries too, but certainly the US and Chinese offsets of deficits and surpluses are the biggest and most visible imbalances. And then there's the Seoul Development Consensus, which has the G20 action plan for infrastructure investment nested into it, so that in effect the G20's global growth strategy and the emphasis on green growth is itself an integrated strategy which includes financial stability, includes global rebalancing, includes development, and includes green growth. So again, you have a set of agenda items which are inextricably linked, because without any of them, each of them falls. So, really the problem is the implementation of that agenda. I know many of you are skeptical about the role of the G20, and we'll come back to that on the panel the fourth panel this afternoon. I'll have things to say about that, and we'll try to address that. But I would say this key element here in terms of this clash of ideas is the fact that the world has yet to fully absorb the lessons of the current crisis. And the lesson of the current crisis is quite clearly, in my judgment, that hands-off, laissez-faire capitalism leads to volatility, leads to imbalances, leads to inequality, and leads to absolutely unacceptable social outcomes. High unemployment, increased poverty, and social degradation. So the clear message, the clear lesson from this, and the thing that the world needs to digest fully, is the fact that hands-off capitalism doesn't work, that having a role for governments is essential. And the main reason it's essential is that without it, there's no locus for people, for public responsibility for public outcomes. So there's nowhere you can go to say, hey, how come this is turning out so badly for me? We are living in a world of hurt. Unemployment rates are incredibly high, incomes have dropped, poverty has increased, things have gotten worse for masses of people across all countries in all walks of life. And the reason is that that market fundamentalism took us too far in the direction of thinking that liberalization of markets and that market forces could generate Pareto optimal social outcomes, which has surely not happened. So the only way to correct this is not to then say, well, we need a resurgence of socialism, we need state intervention on behalf of the people. Of course not. But what is needed is, again, going back to the Korean experience, the Korean model, is selective, pragmatic accumulation of authority and responsibility in public interventions by public agencies, and with accountability to the public itself for generating outcomes which lead to simultaneously to financial stability, social inclusion, and economic growth. That's the imperative. So this is an agenda, it seems to me, that warrants joining what I would call the conservative and the progressive agendas. Conservatives feel that fiscal responsibility, or so they say, although Republican administrations in the United States have behaved quite differently, is that they're in favor of fiscal discipline. Why fiscal discipline? There's been a big debate in economics about exchange rates being the anchor against inflation. It was a flipped around debate that we got it wrong again. The anchor for price stability and for financial stability and exchange rate stability is fiscal discipline. It's clear from the debate in Europe now. The reason why they're resorting to a fiscal compact and why there's this big debate about sovereignty in Europe is because without fiscal discipline, the Europeans most of the major countries in Europe have violated the Maastricht goal of fiscal deficits not exceeding 3% of GDP. And there were no consequences to that, no means of disciplining that. It's very difficult to do, but it's clear it has to be done. Anybody who claims that it doesn't matter how big your fiscal deficit is doesn't understand anything about what's going on in the world today. So the conservative agenda on fiscal policy should be the agenda for all of us. It's not a conservative agenda. In fact, it's just the way the world works. So that part of the conservative agenda needs to be there. And all of us who consider ourselves to be progressive need to support that. But that is not enough. It is not enough. We've been through a period where the IMF has painted itself in a corner where you do financial stability first, and you do economic, and as a consequence of achieving financial stability, then you will get economic growth. And that's the debate that's going on in Europe right now. And that's a fallacious debate. The issue is, how do you achieve financial stability at the same time that you promote economic growth? That's the agenda. That's the responsibility of economists, to figure out how you pragmatically, in each circumstance which is different, you fashion a policy that can achieve multiple goals simultaneously, not one goal at a time sequentially through the system, thinking you can preserve financial stability. You should do financial stability first and economic growth later. It's a bogus strategy. So the conclusions that I reach from this experience, both with the Korean, looking at the Korean experience, looking at the G20 agenda, is that what's necessary is two things. One is a move towards selective borrowing from best practice. And in terms of the questions posed in this panel, it's not a question of emulating the Korean experience, as stellar as it is. It's a question of taking the experiences of lots of different successful countries, of which there are many now, not just 4 as in the 1980s. There are multitudes of countries now, a dozen or more. Is looking at all of those experiences in each country in its own way, in its own cultural norms, in terms of its own priorities, selecting from this menu of best practices those things that fit their circumstances at a given moment in time, moving forward with them in a sequential, selective, and pragmatic way, leaving ideology aside, not being worried about the politics of whether it's progressive or conservative or liberal or not, but what works and what will work for you and what combination of policies you can put together to achieve dynamism the way that Koreans have so successfully done over 5 decades. And the final thing is that the global green growth agenda that's embedded in the G20 should be looked at as, and in the Seoul Development Consensus as well, as economic growth with social inclusion, with environmental balance, not as a question of having the new Seoul Development Consensus emphasis on economic growth substitute for the social and environmental agenda that was in the MBGs. These are clearly complementary things. The clash of ideas that's been going on throughout the last decades means precisely that instead of a clash, we need a convergence. We need a convergence of the social, the environmental, the human agenda with the economic and financial agenda so that all these goals can be achieved simultaneously. And there's no reason that it can't be done. It's not a political impossibility. It's just, it requires more pragmatism than anything else. Thank you very much.